And I'm going to change this. I get the honor of introducing you our next training. So thank you to everybody for joining us to hear from Noya Woodridge. I'm so excited that she was able to join us. Um, and now the next section of our meeting is really focused on our training series. And today we're really focused on the on how unconscious bias and racism might impact our work on parent-child observation, which is an important strategy and process that we use in family home visiting. And as you know, racial disparities are widespread in this state, regardless of where we live. And we want to make sure we give you an opportunity to lean into this observation, the assessment tools that we use, and think about how it might play out, both our unconscious biases and the biases that we have in our decision making and referral process. So I'm going to, Jesse, do you want to pull up your slides while I do a quick introductions then? We have a number of people who helped do the planning and preparation for today. We have Jessie Flynn, who is a licensed independent clinical social worker and endorsed as an infant mental health specialist, who will be leading our presentation today. We really appreciate the support that Hennepin County has provided to cover Jessie's time in working with us on this presentation. But Jessie received her master's degree from the University of Minnesota and a certificate of infant to early childhood mental health from the university. Oh, wait, her master's degree is from the University of Chicago. My apologies. And the infant and early childhood mental health certificate is from the University of Minnesota. In her practice, she focuses on perinatal mental health, parenting, trauma, and supporting families with children ages 0 to 6. She's trained in attachment and biobehavioral catch-up, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and circle of security parenting. Jessie is also the co-founder of Mother Baby Program at Hennepin Healthcare, and a teaching specialist at the Institute of Child Development at the University of Minnesota. And joining her today, Paula Frisk is a member of our coalition's executive committee and is a licensed marriage and family therapist endorsed in infant mental health. Paula was a home visitor for 15 years before moving into her current position, where she oversees the family home visiting programs at St. David's and provides clinical consultation and reflective practice in groups in Hennepin County. So I want to welcome you both and turn it over to Jessie, who will lead us off.
Thank you, Laura. I'm just trying to get my screen pulled up here in a way that everybody can see it. So just give me 1 second. Okay. I was overconfident in my skills for sharing, but hopefully everybody can see that first slide. Wonderful. So I'm grateful to be here today and to be joined by all of you, and then my co-presenter Paula Frisk. She and I will kind of bounce back and forth as we go through the work today. I think just to start off, I'll talk more about myself as part of this work, but just to say that I am certainly on this as a white woman on this journey of racial consciousness for myself and understanding the impact of bias in my life and in my work with children and families. I am by no means an expert, but on my own journey, and hope to share a little bit of that with you today at one part, as a way to say sort of we're collectively all in this work together, and the recognition that certainly for me, this will be sort of lifelong work. So this is an overview of our time together this morning. And I just want to start by talking about this comes from the Courageous Conversations About Race by Glenn Singleton. It's a framework for how to engage in conversation around race and racism. I spent a small period of time doing some mental health consultation for a school district, and they really used this framework across the district, and it really impacted me and sort of I just appreciated the framework and guidance around how to have some of these conversations. So I thought we would start with sort of these 4 agreements for us today, as we're talking about something that can often make people uncomfortable. So the first agreement is that we stay engaged, and I think the acknowledgement that we have a natural inclination as human beings to sort of move away from things that are uncomfortable, but that we are sort of agreeing to stay sort of emotionally, physically, psychologically present today together, even when it gets uncomfortable. The second agreement is to speak our truths. And I know for me as a white person, I think sometimes I think too much about what I'm going to say and how it will be perceived by others, or kind of frame it in a way that I think will sound good to others, as opposed to really speaking my truth. So that is my intention and agreement and hope today that I can do that. The third is that it's uncomfortable. We will experience discomfort. It's normal, but our efforts to stay engaged together is so important, even in the midst of that. And the idea is, how can we have safe conversation even when we feel uncomfortable? And then the last one I think is particularly calming for me, which was to expect and accept non-closure. So we are not going to solve the issue of how bias impacts us in our work, particularly around parent-child assessment. We won't have sort of a neat and clean to-do, but I think our ability to engage in this conversation today and ongoing is the work, even if we don't and we won't solve it today. So I hope that those are sort of our agreements going in today. I hope those sound good and sort of help us all stay present with each other today. And I'm going to pass it off to Paula, my colleague. And Paula, I'm happy to advance slides for you if that's helpful.
Sounds great. I'll just let you know when I'm ready to move. Thanks, Jesse. And I also want to acknowledge, as Jesse did, to the journey that I'm on in doing this. Certainly, again, not an expert here, but continuing to learn and grow and make mistakes and try to repair. Grateful to just be here with all of you in this process and in this learning environment. So we're going to talk today about, as Jesse said, about how unconscious bias plays into our the work we do with families. And a lot of that is around observation and assessment. And we know that it's important to talk about this because the racial disparities are widespread in the work that we do. And this is just some of the data from Minnesota. You'll see here, and we know a lot of this, that there's unevenness in the child protection referrals and mental health referrals, also in the diagnostic process for mental health and the diagnoses themselves. There's a disproportionate number of preschool expulsion in the Black and Brown community. There's also special education participation differences and a lack of culturally congruent care providers. And this is just some of the data and really speaks to why we need to pay more attention about how we are in this work. And we are going to talk today about how our observation and assessment process can contribute to these disparities, how we as home visitors and supervisors can be more intentional about paying attention to our own unconscious bias and how that can impact our work with families. You can go to the next one, Jesse. All right, so assessments and home visiting. I just want to acknowledge that we all come from different models and evidence-based models or evidence-informed models of home visiting. And so there's lots of different opportunities and lots of different models of observation and assessments that we do. So I'm hoping to talk a little bit more in general than around specifics, although I may give some specific examples as well as we talk today. But really want to acknowledge that some of the basic assessments and observations that we all do include child development screens, parent-child interaction assessments, and parental well-being screens. We know that unrecognized personal biases can compromise the integrity of any assessment and the reliability of the conclusions that we come to. So it's really important to pay attention to ourselves in these. And as we've been talking about in these trainings, it's important to continue to be curious about ourselves in these interactions and continue to work on our own awareness of our own conscious and unconscious biases. And Jesse's gonna go deeper and talk with us more about ways in which we can do that. While removing all biases is really likely unattainable, there are some things we can do to mitigate it, and that's what we're going to think about together today. So the observations and assessments that we do usually include a variation of both formal and informal observations. And we know that bias can creep in during any point during those observations and assessments. And we really want to think about all of the ways that we are part of that process, beginning with how we introduce the assessment to a family. How we talk about the why behind the assessment can really set the stage for feelings like anxiety or judgment, or it can help us with the family feeling comfortable and interested in what's next for their child and how their child is developing and growing. One of my very favorite quotes is by Jerry Paul: "How we are is as important as what we do." And I really think this speaks here to just even thinking about how we do these assessments, how we introduce them, all of that. How we are is so important. Being thoughtful about what this might be like for the caregiver and the child is really key. We know there's a stigma around mental health issues and differing abilities, and just being curious about what that means for families and their children and how they think about those things. We might want to wonder even about the term assessment and what that means to them. Their past experience of testing or school can really inform those feelings that come up around that word, and can really trigger some difficult feelings in some families' cases. So paying attention to all those things as we're thinking about how we introduce an observation or an assessment to a family. The other part is really just the actual process of completing the assessment or observation. I have the word objective in my mind in parentheses, and I always think about it that way. You know, we're humans, we're not machines. And so we bring our own values and beliefs and experiences to these objective observations. So the work is really to pay attention to ourselves in these observations as well as who we're observing. Can we allow for curiosity and what emotions are coming up for us in those moments, and try to be as subjective as we possibly can, knowing that we bring ourselves to this, making the observations and our thoughts and judgment come along with it. And Jesse's going to talk more about the importance of reflective practice and stepping back to think about those experiences. I think that's so important because we sometimes minimize or underestimate how much we impact families and how much families impact us. Most assessments have been tested or normed with certain populations, but not all of them. And there can be bias in the questions. I'm going to just focus a little bit on the ASQ for examples of that. I know many of us use that as developmental screens in our work. In some cultures, there's a belief that using a mirror can steal a child's spirit, and other cultures have strong beliefs against putting children on the floor to play until a certain age. It's important to understand the intent of the questions that you're asking in these screens and assessments, and really determine if the developmental task can be observed in another way. The ASQ's made cultural adaptations and they have guidelines on their website. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. If it's helpful, I can provide or have Kati provide that web address if you want to take a look at that. I imagine many of you have been trained on the ASQ, and so maybe are aware of that already, but those are important adaptations to think about as you consider the individual needs of your families. Some of these even include adjusting the score to omit questions that are not appropriate for the child. But overall, it's really important to have conversations with families about the values and beliefs they have and start to consider if particular questions might lead to bias. And again, always paying attention to yourself in it. Are some of the family's values and beliefs different than mine? Different than your values? Could they cause me to move towards judgment? Always trying to pay attention to that, right? Things like, how does the family view a child's independence? Is that a really important thing, or is that less important to them? And so it might impact kind of that ability to go out and explore and them encouraging that exploration. Does the family place importance on the child being quiet or unobtrusive? So is some of the language, what we might think of delayed, is part of how they think about communication in their household and what a child's role is there. And how does a family think about gender identity? We recently had a conversation with my team about one of the questions that's on the ASQ that asks, does your child know if they're a boy or a girl? And it can be a sensitive question, depending on really how a family and how you value gender identity. So, in that process, really being thoughtful about what you're asking, why you're asking, and how you're doing it. And lastly, the other part is, well, not lastly, another piece is interpreting, right? We then take those questions that we ask and those observations that we make, and we make interpretations of those results. So it's so important to weigh the information you've learned from the family and your conversations to figure out what would be helpful for them to know. And how might you deliver this information to them? And the delivery, what will be the impact on that, taking in that information? What's the impact going to be on that parent-child relationship? Hoping that, and imagine that you do a lot of this, is partnering with families to think about what are the next steps. Is this something they can take the lead on? Is this something they really want you to walk alongside them with? Do they want you to be with them in holding on and monitoring? Are they ready to take the next step? I'm really paying attention to this process. And if you believe the family could benefit from a referral, how might you hold on to what you know about this caregiver and child and having that conversation? So Jesse's moved us to the ladder of influence, and I had never seen this graphic before. I really, really like it. And she's going to go into more detail about it, but you can really see from this great visual that there's so many ways that our unconscious bias can impact the data that we collect in these formal and informal observations and assessments. At every level, there's opportunity here for those to creep in. So even more reason for us to be intentional of paying attention to those implicit or unconscious biases. And so I am going to pass it back to Jesse, and we're going to take a little deeper dive into how to think about these.
Thanks, Paula. So I know that many of you have already participated in a training with Diane Banago in the training series. And so covering this topic around different topics that impact home visiting. So we'll just sort of start with a review. So we sort of all know, have a working definition of what is bias. This I pulled from UCSF. So bias is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that's considered to be unfair. Biases may be held by an individual, group, or institution and can have negative or positive consequences. So obviously we're talking about unconscious bias, also known as implicit bias. Those are kind of used interchangeably. And I appreciate the marking that it can have negative or positive consequences. I think about there was a seminal study in 2003 by two Harvard researchers, I believe, that found discriminatory practices for job seekers based on using, traditionally Black sounding names versus white sounding names on resumes. And that study has been replicated multiple times. So an example of sort of negative impact for Black population, but a positive impact of bias for white job seekers in that study. The thing about unconscious biases, they develop at an early age. Research shows that they emerge during middle childhood and appear to develop across childhood. They have real world effects on our behavior. I think the hope for us and why we're together today is that they are malleable or changeable, that we can take steps to minimize the impact of unconscious bias, even if it's sort of ever present. So this sort of brings us to kind of the development of biases, which I think probably many of you have seen the cultural iceberg at some point in your lives and careers. But I appreciate the reminder of sort of, what we see or what we attribute to culture, kind of the what and behaviors and artifacts, observable, conscious, taught. These are sort of those things that we can see, but really the why of culture, the things that are maybe unconscious to us, they are not directly observable. And these are kind of the attitudes, beliefs, expectations, values, assumptions that sort of drive our being. And so if culture, sort of the way that we're raised, really our biases develop out of that. I think about how many of us have been trained in cultural competence and sort of how we engage cross-culturally in our work. So I wondered if people would be willing to just like write in the chat a word or a phrase in terms of how you would define cultural competence. And we'll just sort of look at that together. Do we have anyone brave enough to drop something in the chat? Understanding ways of being among different cultures. Open-hearted. Listening. Open mind, open mind. Understanding the beliefs and values of cultures other than your own. Vulnerability, adapting to diversity, awareness, open eyes, ears, heart. Authentic willingness to learn. Being aware of your own culture and how it can be different than others. ability to understand people from different cultures, aware of yourself and others, having an awareness of your own biases and how you move with them, understanding norms, traditions, and practices, and being open and respectful to all, understanding there's dimensionality to how we see and interact with others, accepting that your experience is not the same as others. Thank you, everybody. So what I appreciate about this, I'm going to see if I can try to close up my chat, is I think that I learned a lot about cultural competence, over my career, but less about cultural humility. Many of you in your definitions describe aspects of, I think, what is now understood as cultural humility, which has really been an impactful shift for me. Cultural competence sort of implies historically has implied sort of learning about others so that you can effectively function as an individual with people who have come from a different background than you. Cultural humility, which many of you touched on, is this lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, where we not only learn about another's culture, but we start with an examination of ourselves and our own beliefs and cultural identity. And I think for me, I will I'll speak my truth in that I don't think that's something I thought about until more recently in my career, how important it was to start with an examination of myself. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I really think this shift is so important because I think one way that cultural competence, some criticism of that word is that it sort of implies that there are sort of categories that you can get competent in. It sort of has a finite ending versus what we know about sort of a ongoing process of reflection and understanding and learning, which is what we're trying to do today. So one important way to minimize the impact of our unconscious bias in our work is to increase our awareness and understanding of ourselves, our cultural experiences, and then their impact on others. So let's start. So if we're kind of thinking about ourselves and building our own racial and cultural consciousness, I want you to just think on your own, and maybe I'll give you a minute or two. I'd love it if you wanted to write one or two things down, but to think on your own. We're not going to share it. But in what ways does your race or culture impact your own personal life? And then maybe you want to think about determining the percentage of your life from 0 to 100% that is impacted by by race or culture, yours or others. And again, these questions and this sort of framing also come from the Courageous Conversations about Race. So maybe just take a minute or two and write one or two things down. We're going to have time to share in a small group if you choose. I think I want to give my own example. about sort of my journey of racial and cultural consciousness. And the way I want to do that is by sharing a little bit of my autobiography, and then some truths I think I've come to in my life. And one of those I'll sort of preemptively say is that I definitely did not understand the impact of race in my life. I thought, I think for many years that was about people of color and not about me. And I have learned a lot more about that in terms of my race and culture and how very, very present it actually is. So to do that, I think I've had to look back over my life and understand sort of, you know, that below the iceberg where my cultural experiences and how they impact me. I will say that I'm experiencing lots of discomfort in sharing this information. It's uncomfortable, but I think clearly has allowed me to really get in touch and increase my own racial consciousness. So the first is that I grew up in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, called Upper Arlington. I'm obviously white, female, cisgender, middle class, educated person. The suburb I grew up in was currently, and it 86.5% white. I don't think it was much different when I was growing up. Currently, no households report non-English language spoken there. And the poverty rate there is about 1.82% compared with 11.4% nationally. My experiences with BIPOC communities were largely driven by my dad, who was a Protestant minister and the only white member of this interdenominational ministerial alliance. It was a group of clergy he was the only white member of. And so I had lots of experiences through then of connecting with the events that they had. But I went to Miami University of Ohio. Again, their demographics are 75% white. My first experience of being sort of a non-majority culturally and racially was when I studied abroad in Costa Rica. However, I was told constantly and very aware of the fact that sort of my blonde hair at that time and blue eyes were sort of desirable physical traits. And then over time, my dad has become really interested in genealogy and our family history, our descendants, and you know, in his side in our family history, there's evidence of participation in slavery as well as other racial violence. So this was the lens in which I grew up. I would say my dad always called himself, he used the term recovering racist, I think, as a way to acknowledge that you can't come from that kind of history and not have these racial biases. I think now we would say that, you know, we're engaging in anti-racist work, that you know, I know Dr. Ibram Kendi says there isn't any racist or not, there's no such thing as not racist. So I think that's the words that my dad would use. And these are the things that I think are true about me. I have had little experience feeling uncomfortable in a group due to my race. I have more recently in my life come to recognize myself racially and culturally. I used to subscribe to the belief that I was one of the good white people, and therefore my unconscious biases were for sure out of my awareness. I struggle to know when to use my voice and when to listen as a white person, and I have been both too silent and too loud. I am working hard to express gratitude when my biases are pointed out instead of acting defensively when that is pointed out. And just to say that I have benefited profoundly from my relationships with people of color in terms of my own learning and racial consciousness, and likely definitely benefited more than they have from me, particularly around this issue. All of this to say, I think it's painful to look back and look at that, and yet I think knowing this about myself and understanding this about myself has made it easier for me to try to express gratitude when my biases are pointed out, because of course I have them, as well as sort of really lean into this work, you know, both personally, but certainly as it impacts my work with children and families, and sort of my lack of awareness earlier in my career. I have stories where I have caused harm unintentionally. So
Can I ask a question, Jessie?
yeah.
This is Hazel, Hazel Tanner. So
Hi, Hazel.
I'm interested in hearing your aha moments when you were some that was pointed out. I've been to a number of these discussions, and so we talk in generalities, and so I'm interested so people can understand their implicit but unconscious biases. So give us some examples so other people can understand what implicit bias, what did you learn? You know, what something that you probably said casually in a conversation and somebody pointed it out to you. So I think people need to know some examples.
Okay, great question, Hazel. I do have a couple examples. So I come from mental health field, and worked a lot in perinatal mental health with moms. And so I got feedback from a Black mother who came through the program, who so I was very focused on her experience of trauma, both within her childhood, but contextually sort of growing up as a Black woman in the United States. And the feedback that I got was, you keep talking about my trauma. I came here to get help with anxiety. And I think that for me showed my bias, because we had white moms in the program at the same time who also had childhood abuse or trauma. And but I think that I was able to focus and lean on their anxious worries and thoughts. And for her, she had them also, but I focused on her trauma. And for her, it felt totally dismissive of what she came in to get help with. I also have been told that I think that as a white woman, I have come to realize, I'm not sure fully what the belief there is, that that tears are evidence of sort of emotional processing. And I have also gotten feedback from a particular Black mom who said, you just want me to cry, and because I'm not crying, you think there's a problem with that, or that shows that I'm not progressing, or I'm in denial, that sort of thing. So that was something I really had to look at, and I think that that's true. I think I somehow see tears as a form of healing and connection to the inner experience, when that may not at all be how someone connects to their inner experience. Those are two examples. I don't know if others would feel brave to share any. I have more, but I also want to be conscious of our time. Hazel, how does that sound or feel to you?
That's perfect, and that's what I'm interested in hearing, and other people need to hear, because it's those little tweaks that happens when you're dealing with a person who doesn't look like you. And so what I've heard that your implicit unconscious bias is that you're going for the trauma for the Black woman, and you pointed it out, and I like that you did that, that you're able to distinguish that for the person, white person, you dealt with the anxiety. And so I think one of the key things for me is that when you're working with a person of color, is how can I help you? What do you want to work on? If you went with that approach and not make assumptions, about what they need in their trauma, because some of the things that you might think is a problem for the client, they can handle it on their own. They need something else. So unless you ask them, how can I help you best at the time that we have now? What can we deal on? What can we focus on? And then really listen at the body language, the tone of their speech, and how they're interacting. So the nonverbal cues are what you're going to really get. If you look at the nonverbal cues, that'll give you the answers that you need, what you need to work on. And being an active listener when you're working with the client, don't really have a ready answer while a client is talking, because you're going to miss something in that conversation. I don't want to take over. That's enough.
Thank you so much, Hazel. Those it also brought to mind. I'll give one more concrete example. So I did a lot of group psychotherapy with Black and white moms, and all kinds of moms from different racial and cultural backgrounds. And I learned about so there's a lot. It was a mental health program, so lots of expression of big emotions. And I believe that as the therapist in the room, there were experiences where I, my part of my job is to help keep the group safe enough. And I think that I allowed more white women to express sort of tearful sadness, crying, that I allowed that in the group, and shut down Black women who were maybe more irritable, angry, agitated, showed some of those emotions, that I was sort of more tolerant of sadness and worry than angry or upset. And I've learned about tone policing now, and I do believe I did that it was sort of that tone wasn't tolerable to me as a white person. So, thinking about the safety in the group room, and I think I caused harm from that. And so that is something that I don't think I recognized in the moment. It's been sort of outside of that, my own learning. So I think I didn't have opportunities to repair because it was outside of my awareness. So I appreciate you asking for concrete examples, Hazel. I'm very sweaty, but it's, so important to acknowledge them. And I appreciate the question very much. There were a couple things in the chat.
We had one hand raised, and I believe it was Jacqueline Thomas. Yep.
Good morning. This is Drake. Thank you for doing it. Thank you, Jess, for being courageous. Or is it Jesse? I'm sorry.
Either one.
I just wanted to make a statement in regards to speaking of the crying and a white woman, recognizing that in a white woman, Black women and white women, we manage our trauma, our crisis, we manage them differently. But it's also been some proven studies that have started to come out that even when Black women are crying, white women still dismiss that. And where our tears and our cries, it doesn't mean anything, it's just overlooked. And in the same way, it's dismissed. In a way, it's dismissed, but it's valid, but we manage them differently, our traumas, our issues, our crises. So it's not going to look the same as it does for a privileged white woman. My trauma isn't going to look. We, Black women, Black individuals, do hold back sometime, and we hold back because we have systematically been experienced just what's starting to rise to the surface, that when we cried, it didn't matter. So we need to save ourselves and not have that emotion come out, because then we can't manage the situation at hand because the crying isn't going to help. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Yeah, I've learned a lot more about white women's tears, and how harmful and dismissive they can be towards people of color. You know, how attention can turn to a white woman who's crying versus sort of the racism or distress that people of color are sharing. Thank you so much. I appreciate the question so much. I'll share back my screen here. And feel free to stop me at any point. That was really good and helpful. So I think this ladder of influence for me just showed a representation of all the potential steps we go from sort of observing to taking action. And that all of those spots allow for the inclusion of our own subjectivity and bias. And so what I added to this ladder of influence was this orange circle, which is, it's sort of hard to see, but it says my cultural and racial lens. And then of course, our training and experience, right? Those, but it's sort of about us. It's not just about the families, but it's about how our training and experience, and probably more importantly, our cultural and racial lens that impacts sort of what we decide to observe, what we pull out from our observations, how we make meaning of what we're seeing in parents and children, making assumptions, conclusions, beliefs, and then taking action. And so what I am learning and trying hard to lean into is, I found this quote that we reinforce unconscious bias when we don't talk about or address issues of race, and I added culture. I think both are important. I think when we just talk about culture, you know, I think sometimes as a white person, it feels, yeah, let's talk about culture, not race. But I think when we only talk about race, then we miss sort of these other, the cultural pieces that contribute. So I appreciate both of them. And I think that is true when we reinforce them, when we don't talk about them. So, you know, with, we thought that it would be nice just to give you all, just because this is a meaty subject, an emotional subject for us, to give you some time to reflect in small groups. You won't know each other necessarily, I don't think, because we're kind of randomly put you in. So I just want everybody to know that you can share how much or how little that you want. These were some questions that I thought to start to think about, kind of, if you wanted to share what was my percentage of the impact of race on my life. If it wasn't 100%, why might this be? So I think I'm a person who didn't think my race impacted me 100%. I realize now that my race as a white person, my white culture 100% impacts me and every interaction that I have. Which parts of my identity am I aware of? Which parts of my identity are privileged or not? What cultural norms and values do I bring to the home visiting and observation process? Again, there's 5 questions for you to sort of choose from, and again, share how much or how little that you want. There won't be a facilitator or one of us in there with you, so we're really relying on you to sort of engage in this to the extent that you want. And I would just encourage, like I said, I know as a white person, I have been told I have been too silent. And so I just encourage any white people in the group to really try to use your voice and talk about your experience in your small group. So maybe Laura, I think we're going to go for about 15 minutes to talk about this together. So Laura is going to, I think, get us into breakout rooms.
I believe you have to click on the breakout rooms and join.
Oops. I wonder, is there a way for me to drop the questions in the chat?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. If I just put it in the regular chat, will everybody be able to see it?
Yep. Okay. We'll broadcast this. Oops.
Oh, did you see Serene message, Laura?
No.
She needs
I
to.
handled it.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Jacqueline had to step away for a minute.
Hello?
Hello.
It said you moved me to a group, but I don't think I got moved anywhere.
Oh.
You gotta click on the breakout rooms at the bottom and then click join. Do you see
Okay.
any of that stuff?
Okay, got it.
Perfect. Can we move people in?
So Jacqueline stepped away, so maybe that's why she's not in.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if Pat needs help
Okay.
getting in a group.
I need to step away for a minute. Oh,
No, I just been doing something and I'm monitoring but not able to participate, and I didn't want to be disrespectful to people and sit in a small group and voyeur.
Okay, sounds good.
That seemed most inappropriate.
Okay.
So I'll voyeur you guys, but not them.
all right. I broadcasted them as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's just, okay, so Jacqueline stepped away. All right, that's great. Well done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so, yeah, it's so
Oh, you know what?
important.
You made it, Nidra. You weren't sure you were gonna make it.
Well, I still have to leave in about 5 minutes,
Oh,
after, but I wanted to jump in when I could.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. I'm glad
And I
you-
hit the button before we finished talking. I was.
Oh, don't you hate that? You're like, oh yes,
Yeah,
I'll
I don't
go.
want them to think that I just, it said 45 seconds and I thought I was moving at night. And I've known this, we've only been on Zoom for 3, 4, 5 years now.
Right. I
So,
know.
I hope
It
they didn't
happens.
think I was just jumping out.
Well,
Wow.
everyone is back. So
I
you
was in Molly's group.
Hey, Nina.
I hit the button too fast.
I was like, Nidra, where did you go?
I hate that about breakout rooms. People get cut off mid talking.
I
So I
didn't
guess
mean
that
to do
leads us
that.
back to our fourth agreement was to expect non-closure. I think we
Molly
brought
was
you
in
back.
there, Molly was in there. I
yeah.
thought, oh, they're gonna
Yeah.
think I just hung up on them.
No. We brought you back a little bit early, just in the interest of time. But I think our hope is that, as we continue to we're sort of exercising our racial consciousness muscle every time we engage in these kinds of discussions. So again, sort of the non-closure piece, this is sort of an ongoing conversation that we hope that you can have after, of course, after this time together. So we wanted to show a video now. I don't know how many people have seen it. But Mill City Kids was a group, some of you I know were on this team of people kind of thinking about racial disparities, particularly for Black and Indigenous families. And they created this really amazing video of, it talks at the beginning about the impact of historical trauma. But then Dr. Helen Kim, who I had the privilege of working with currently, and then for many years at the Mother Baby program, tells a story of how she unintentionally harmed a mom. And so we're going to show that video now together. I'm going to share my screen.
This is a story of how a good person working within a system designed to help people create new trauma.
My name is Dr. Helen Kim. I'm a psychiatrist at a large inner city hospital and the director of a program that serves pregnant and postpartum moms with depression and trauma. Our goal is to save and improve lives by helping distressed moms protect and nurture their children and to help them parent with awareness, love, and compassion. I'd like to share with you the story of a young mom who we'll call M. M has a 4-month-old baby B who is in foster care. She was referred to our Mother Baby mental health program for evaluation and treatment. M is a 22-year-old African-American woman striving for a better life despite her difficult upbringing. She grew up in North Minneapolis in a family with generations of trauma within a neighborhood that itself had experienced historical trauma, which now manifests in violence and poverty. How did North Minneapolis experience trauma as a neighborhood? The area was once vibrant and economically stable up until the U.S. government passed the 1956 Federal Highway Act. This led to the construction of Interstate 94, now one of Minneapolis's biggest highways, and the deconstruction of the community fabric and vitality of areas like North Minneapolis and St. Paul's Rondo neighborhood. The residents were Black, often poor and politically marginalized, so their neighborhoods represented a path of least resistance for the construction of the highway. Today, the overall rates of poverty in North Minneapolis are much higher than that of the rest of the city, and higher still for its African-American residents. Getting back to M, she has seen, experienced, and overcome a lot to be who she is today, a young woman seeking more from life. But in order for her situation to improve, she will need to be helped, not harmed by organizations and systems set up to serve those facing harsh realities. M grew up in a very chaotic home with a mother who was very young, moody, and abusive, and a physically violent father who left when M was very young. Her mother later met another man who moved into the family's home and was physically abusive to M's mother and also M and M's older sister. M finally couldn't take the chaos and violence at home, so as a teenager, she dropped out of high school, left home, and met a boy named D, a teen who himself had dropped out of high school. His parents were addicted to drugs and failed to care for him all through his life. He had grown up in a family with generations of trauma as well. When D and M met, it was love at first sight. She said they were their own family and they tried to make it on their own. They lived in cars, they couch hopped, they moved into a shelter, they got jobs at a fast food restaurant. The relationship brought stress, including physical abuse, but they were also fiercely loyal to one another. Then M and D unexpectedly got pregnant. The fighting between them got worse as the stress got higher. As a result, D started using drugs and became more violent. He came home high multiple times. African Americans are 1/3 to 1/2 as likely as whites to have access to mental health and addiction treatment. 3 months later, they delivered a healthy baby boy, B. They still had no outside support and were living in the family shelter. Although they were doing their best, neither had healthy parenting models to guide them. The stress continued to heighten after B's birth. They were struggling to make ends meet, and D's drug use was increasing. One night, he came home high and really set in on M. Somehow during the altercation, the baby sustained a skull fracture. About 1/3 of parents who were abused as children continue a pattern of neglectful or abusive parenting. Another third remain vulnerable to social stressors and are more likely to become abusive under such influences. M screamed for help and called 911, and the baby was rushed to the hospital where he lost consciousness and had a seizure. M thought the baby would die, but fortunately B recovered over the subsequent weeks. All the while, D was nowhere to be found, and M was at the hospital alone. Eventually, baby B was discharged, not with his mother M, but to an emergency foster home. So M no longer had her baby, and she then learned that D had been arrested and was in prison. For M, the only good news was that the emergency foster home was a very caring household, and M felt really good about baby B being there. M trusted the emergency foster mother to take care of and protect baby B. M, now without a partner or a child, suddenly lost eligibility to stay at the family shelter and found herself homeless again. The system that was set up to help keep a roof over her head was now putting her back on the street. Unsure of what to do, she decided to move back in with her mom. This was a really hard choice because her mom was furious at M for losing her baby to the system. Her fear and anger came out in these vicious arguments that made living there even worse. During all of this, M was also required to comply with her case plan, which included attending the mother-baby mental health program 5 hours a day for 4 days a week, meeting with a parent educator once a week, and attending a weekly domestic abuse group that cost $25 per session. To comply with this case plan, M had to miss work and lost her job. In addition, the cost of the group therapy posed a problem because when she lost custody of her child, she also lost access to her Minnesota Family Investment Program cash assistance. The baby, meanwhile, was being shipped back and forth between the foster home, daycare, and M's parenting classes. This was in accordance with her case plan and approved by her assigned caseworker. Baby B was regularly placed unaccompanied in the back of a cab driven by a stranger. To have a child placed in the hands of a stranger is something that would cause any mother great distress. This was a very traumatic experience for M that she had to endure repeatedly since this was the only way for her to see her child. Additionally, due to poor communication between her caseworker and the variety of caretakers, the baby did not always arrive where and when M expected, which further increased her level of fear. The baby would sometimes arrive crying or completely emotionally shut down in an unreactive, dissociated state of stress. The caseworkers were often busy and unavailable when M tried to tell them about these issues. To me, it became clear that the system was asking her to be a more protective parent while at the same time forcing her to do things that go against her protective instincts as a mother. Repetitive, highly stressful experiences like these cause changes at the genetic level, affecting one's response to stress and adversity. This was a new form of trauma that M had to navigate, and one that was a result of system practices. In a lot of ways, Em could never focus on the baby because of her perpetual stressed state of fight or flight. Her struggles with money, her negative interactions with systems, her travel back and forth to an unsafe neighborhood, all left her in a heightened state of reactivity, a trauma response, which made it very difficult for her to be present, even when she did have supervised visits with the baby. Chronic toxic stress in an unsupportive environment leads to unregulated release of stress hormones. The result is profoundly negative effects on the brain, including executive function, attention, and memory, and also detrimental effects on physical health. Until the system backed off, Em had little opportunity to succeed or to heal. As her psychiatrist, I thought I could write a letter that would spell out how we needed first to safely and stably house Em to help her lower her stress response and allow her to increase her capacity to parent B. Until then, she couldn't learn the necessary skills because of her threatened, highly reactive state. I did not see her as someone with mental illness, but rather an individual with complex trauma who was being re-traumatized by systems that were set up to help her. The system itself had become a threat to her success. So I wrote a letter about how the system needed to back off in order for Em to regain her ability to focus on B. I also mentioned how she was doing a great job in therapy and had overcome a lot of her own trauma after growing up in a difficult and abusive home. The letter was intended to be used in court to make a case for Em's efforts during her next custody hearing. I failed to ask Em for permission to write this letter, and unfortunately, Em didn't get a chance to read the letter before her court date because I didn't have time to show it to her. And if I'm really honest with myself, I thought I didn't need to because I thought it was a pretty good letter. When Em walked into the courtroom, she felt as though everyone, the judge, the opposing attorney, the system caseworker, her public defender, everyone was reading this letter except her. The judge later praised her in front of everyone for overcoming so much and trying to be a good parent despite her horribly abusive childhood. Unbeknownst to the judge, Em's mother was also in the courtroom. She was shocked and felt completely attacked, exposed, and humiliated, especially after stepping up to help take care of Em and her baby. Em's mom was furious, and the two of them nearly got into a fist fight upon leaving. The next day, Em said to me in a very gracious way, with tears in her eyes, "Dr. Kim, I wish you didn't write that letter. It made my life so much worse." My mom threatened to kick me out of the house. We almost got into another fist fight. I got her to calm down, but that letter made things so much worse for me. I wish you hadn't written it. This was a very painful thing to hear from Em. I let her know that I was sorry for how much I had hurt her. We had some tears together. Em said to me, "It's okay, Dr. Kim. We're going to put this away and move on." Afterward, I reflected on how brave Em was to tell me how I had hurt her with my letter and how generous she was to forgive me for my mistake. I thought about what would have happened if Em had been a white, educated, professional woman. Would I have dared to write a letter without her permission? Or to send it to her lawyer without showing it to her first? If I'm totally honest with myself, I have to say no, I wouldn't have. I do have my own implicit racist bias, and that somehow her being young and Black affected what I felt I could do for her instead of with her. Although my intentions were good, I caused her further harm. I realized one can have good intentions, yet harmful impact.
Okay. Oops.
M, D, and B
Sorry about
interacted with
that.
a system that was not only fragmented, but also not responsive to their needs.
Okay. Um, this video is available. I think it impacts me every time I read it. I was alongside Dr. Kim with this experience with this mom. It's true, it's genuine. I think something I'm always struck with is that this mom told her how harmful she had been. I don't think we always get that privilege of being told that. She also was open to Dr. Kim's attempts to repair, which I think speaks to the quality of their relationship prior to this event. But I'm always struck by that she was able to say how much she harmed her. And I know that that I have had experiences where I have harmed and haven't been told about it and haven't noticed it. And so I try very hard to notice when ruptures occur. You know, if someone withdraws, if someone, you know, gets angry if someone stops coming, you know, to notice those signs and consider my role in all of that. So super hard work, but I think we're closing on a time, and Paula is going to talk about like, so what now? I will say that this video is available, and because we don't have as much time to talk about it here as a group, you could consider taking it back to your team, to your agency, and reflect. And the website actually has some discussion questions to go along with it. But I'm going to share my screen here again real quick, and I'll just say quickly before I come, I think Paula's going to talk more about next steps. I was going to talk about reflective practice. I think I just want to acknowledge that as an infant early childhood field, we sort of come with this gold standard resource and way of practicing, which is a reflective based practice. I know a lot of you have reflective supervision or consultation. I think that being built into our field is such a gift. I think what I would love to see is for us to keep race and culture more on the table in those reflective supervision consultation experiences. I know I do reflective supervision and consultation, and as a white woman, I have not always kept it on the table. I'd like to see us do more of that. And I think the field, that has been a failing in the field. And there's just now starting to be more research around that. And so I think we come with that. And so that's one of our strengths. And yet there's so much more we can do around this particular issue. So I'm going to pull our slides back up here, which always takes me longer than I wish it would. Okay. Here it is. And pass it here to Paula.
All right. Yes, as Jesse said, we didn't intend for this training to give you all the answers and the how-tos, but just to start the conversation and start some of the process of thinking about how we might be more intentional about unconscious bias as it relates to our parent-child observations and assessments, and wanted to give you maybe some ideas of how to bring this forward in hopes that it's not another one and done training, that you bring this forward to your teams and think more about it, or into your individual supervision, as Jesse talked about, or your group supervision, whatever would be helpful. One of the pieces that we thought would be helpful in thinking about this, or something you might want to look at and starting some conversations, are the diversity informed tenets. And these are really, they were developed by the Harris Foundation, Irving Harris Foundation, in order to talk about the work that we do with infants and children and family, and give some guiding practices and principles to really help us be more intentional and have the capacity as professionals and systems and organization to embed diversity and inclusion and equity into our work. So these are the first 7 tenets. I'm not going to spend a lot of time just because we have just a few minutes left, but just wanted to touch on a few of them. That first one we talked a lot about today: self-awareness leading to better services for families. And then number 3, really working to acknowledge privilege and combat discrimination. We know there's lots of discriminatory policies and practices that harm adults, and in turn then harm the children that they care for. We want to really acknowledge privilege where we hold it and use it strategically and responsibly to combat bias and all of the isms that exist. Number 4, super important, right? Recognize and respect non-dominant bodies of knowledge. We want to recognize that there are sources of strength and routes to healing within all families and communities that might be different than our traditional Western values or our white culture. And 6 is another important one that we know, right? Language can hurt and heal. And Jessie was great about being vulnerable about some of her experiences with that. And the video showed that too, that language can really divide or connect us. It can hurt or heal us. And we really, as much as we can, try to use language in ways that is most inclusively supportive of all children and families. So one of our thoughts is that you might take this back with you. Here's some other ideas that we had that could be helpful in conversations. Perhaps doing, using the ladder of influence and thinking with your team about where bias comes in and how you can, what you can do as an individual or a team to mitigate some of that. Maybe doing an activity similar to what Jesse did for us, and we talked about a little bit in our small group around racial and cultural autobiography. Really, again, diving into that need to be more aware of your own culture and values to support others. So I can certainly follow up with a few other thoughts or reflection questions that might be helpful for discussion that aren't here as a follow-up to our training too, but want to leave just a few minutes for Laura to close us up.
Great. Thank you. We'll make sure we get these slides out to everybody, the link to the video. I always find that video incredibly powerful. So grateful to see it again. We do have 2 minutes, so I'm wondering if there's anyone who would like to ask a question of our presenters before we wrap up for the morning. If not, I would like to just give you all a heads up. We will send an evaluation out next week, along with the recording and the slides and the resources, suggested next steps. I do want to let all of you know if you know of people who are interested in taking this journey with us and joining the in-person training sessions. We still have space in our greater Minnesota sites. So we still have space in New Ulm, in Duluth, and in Fergus Falls to have you join us. We've hit our limit or very close to our limit at the West St. Paul site, but we would love to engage as many of you as possible. If you know people who are interested, they can reach out to myself or Kati. Kati, why don't you go ahead and while we still have people online, drop your email in the chat so they can reach out to you as well. But I want to thank you all for taking this journey. It is a journey, and knowing how we show up for our families, for the families that we work with, is critically important to helping improve birth and child health outcomes. So thank you. And thank you again to our funders. We couldn't do this training series without your support. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jesse
Thanks,
and Paula,
everyone.
for leading this training.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you for being courageous.
Thank you, Hazel.
Yep. Thank you guys. Take care. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye, Rhonda. Thank you.